welcome a special friend, Dave Secord. I guess first met him because we're both in this kind of unusual and fun program called the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program that was created by Jane Lubchenco, who, as we both talked about last night, has sort of taken the next step in leadership now that she's the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So, kind of an academic who's gone on a particularly large and extraordinary journey. So met then and realized instantly that he was doing something I was really fascinated by, which is that he was kind of a boundary spanner, which is a word we use a lot in SSI, trying to think about both these worlds. He comes out of a pretty similar training, maybe a few notches more accomplished than mine as an ecologist. Worked on rocky intertidal systems with maybe the best known rocky intertidal ecologist in the world, Bob Payne, at the University of Washington. And then stayed there in Washington. He's from that part of the world. Helped launch a new program at a new campus at Tacoma, and then that was very interdisciplinary about environmental issues, and then returned to Seattle to found, well, I don't know exactly what started when, but to help create the program on the environment. And now even bigger than that is this thing called the College of the Environment that Lisa Gromlin leads. She's the dean there. And she's part of this AAAS symposium that will take place in Boston in February that's basically kind of getting people from around the country to talk about how they're trying to do work like SSI. So after having done all those things in very important leadership roles that involved a lot of entrepreneurial efforts in institutions that, as we know, aren't always, the silos can be taller and thicker than we might hope. He entered the world of philanthropy, and that's where a lot of the action, I think, is taking place that takes knowledge sometimes that comes out of universities and other kinds of knowledge and puts it into place-based efforts. And so I think this is meant to be informal. This will probably kind of flow into some of the afternoon conversations. We'll even have some meetings tomorrow morning, and again, if there's anything you didn't get to do that you'd like to, just check with me afterwards. But I'm going to let him tell this story, and I'm looking forward to it. Welcome, Dave.
Okay, hello. It's great to be here. I really like the state of Maine. I spent a sabbatical here 10 years ago, and it's always good to come back. I'm from Washington State, and I always feel this special affinity between the corner states, at least the top ones, so so it's great to be here. My plan today is somewhat diffuse, since there were a lot of different potential things I could talk about that David said you guys might be interested in. So mainly what I'll do is kind of yak at you in a non-linear way about how I got from where I was professionally 15 or so years ago to where I am now, and how this intellectual journey, which feels pretty random a lot of days, actually has some quasi-coherence to it, at least when viewed in retrospect. I have a bunch of slides in here that also have to do with some of the content of my current work doing philanthropic grant making in complex systems, which I think is thematically consistent with a bunch of what you guys are trying to do, bringing the services of academia to complex problems. I may or may not have time to get to all those slides depending upon how long this takes and how much Q&A and interaction there is, and I would like to keep it informal. So if I get to that stuff, great, and if not, we'll have plenty of other opportunities to yak informally. So I threw together this slide this morning because I was trying to illustrate in my own mind, in a few images, how I went from being a graduate student with Bob Payne in a very traditional marine invertebrate ecology lab, working on this beautiful organism, Anthoplura elegantissima, common anemone on the west coast, and how I ended up doing the kinds of things I do now, which I could never have envisioned which is hanging out with people like these. This woman is Anne Henshaw, who lives just down the road here and works at the Oak Foundation. Like me, she's a scholar, used to teach at Bowdoin, anthropologist, archaeologist actually by training, and now she's doing strategic philanthropy and grant making in a foundation. And this woman here is a mutual friend and grantee of ours, Mika Mike, who is an Inuit hunter from Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. And getting to know people like that is not the kind of thing you do when you work on marine invertebrates and go to scientific meetings. It would have been incredibly intimidating to me back then, and I wouldn't have even known why I would want to do it. So it kind of astonishes me that that's the kind of thing I do all the time now. So I'll try and weave together this like 15-year story in about 4.6 minutes. So I entered a PhD program, very traditional marine ecology lab. It was great. About halfway through grad school, I did that thing that grad students do, which is have an existential crisis about whether I really wanted to stay in grad school, whether I really wanted to finish my PhD, and what my casting about for a dissertation topic might have to do with anything of value in the world that I cared about. And I don't know if any of you know Bob Payne, who was my advisor, but he's a tall and intimidating and grumpy man. And so I didn't know how to bring this up with Bob. So I brought it up with Kathy Pfister, who's now on the faculty at the University of Chicago, really good ecologist. She was then what Bob called the alpha graduate student. And I went and had a beer with Kathy, and she talked me off this ledge, and she just said, I think you should talk to Bob. And I said, really? She said, just talk to Bob. He might be nice. He might surprise you. And so I went into Bob's office about halfway through grad school, and I shut the door, which signaled, an important conversation. And I just spilled my guts to Bob. I said, I don't know if I want to be just like you, Bob. I don't know if I want a faculty position. I don't know if all I want to do is straight up disciplinary science. I might want to do something else. And Bob Payne is famous for his pregnant pauses. And so he just sat there and said nothing for what seemed like an eternity. And then finally, he, just like Kathy said, he was actually nice. And he said, Dave, I think you should stay in graduate school. Whatever you decide to do afterwards, I will support you. You will be able to do it, with more clout or effectiveness or something like that afterwards, blah, blah, blah. So I took a deep breath. I went back. I dived back into the literature. I actually identified a dissertation topic, had a couple intense field seasons, finished up, no intention of getting a faculty position. Did what people tell you to do, which is apply for jobs for practice, and I got one. And it was a sabbatical replacement faculty position, so I became an assistant professor on a Monday, having defended my dissertation on a Friday. And then you just kind of do what people tell you to do. Oh, you don't have a tenure track job, so you should apply for jobs. So I applied for jobs, and I got one. And the job I got was an unusual job, as David said. It was tenure track assistant professor at a brand new campus of a rapidly expanding University of Washington system. And so I ended up being one of the first 2 scientists hired and the first biologist at a new university, which was rapidly growing. So I was evaluated based on all the usual stuff, teaching and research, but also this extraordinary amount of institution building and service, designing interdisciplinary curricula, designing science buildings, hiring a bunch of faculty, getting them through the tenure process, getting curricula approved at the state level, building all these community partnerships, all this stuff. So it was a crazy series of years, but it also just took me out of my narrow academic discipline ever so gradually. Got tenure, came on sabbatical to Maine, holed up at the Darling Marine Center on the coast in the snow through a Maine winter with my wife, and wrote some papers and did some soul searching and went back to my job and had the usual post-tenure depression. Whoa, what do we do? You know, what is life about now? Sought some stimulating opportunities, one of which was the Aldo Leopold program that David mentioned, which was really, you know, career-changing and inspirational for me because, again, it was that step on the road toward relevance, not to be snarky about it, but just, you know, the horizon's getting broader and broader. The other formative event that happened that year, which took me further down that path, was in the spring of 2004. I was teaching my marine ecology field course, which I taught every single year, and I took students out to all these fabulous field sites and showed them all sorts of cool ecology in action and invertebrate diversity on the Washington coast and Friday Harbor and all that. Final awesome low tide series of the year. Out on the outer coast, I did something I've done 1,000 times, which is leap a surge channel. I slipped and I fell probably 2.5 meters down into a hole and landed on my back on a boulder covered with barnacles. And the students sort of dragged me out, and I cracked a bunch of ribs and drove 4 hours back to Seattle and got patched up. And after that, I was fine, but I was on morphine and Percocet for a few days. And you should never go back to your office and answer your phone if you're on drugs. This is the lesson, because the phone rings and it's a couple of teens on the Seattle campus of the University of Washington who said, we would like you to come to Seattle and direct this interdisciplinary program called the Program on the Environment, which was a university-wide, very interdisciplinary attempt at an environmental studies program at a great big old research university campus, so very different than kind of starting something interdisciplinary and applied from the grassroots. And of course, deans being deans, they didn't disclose all of the problems with management, budget, and leadership and faculty politics that I'd be inheriting. They just talked me into it. And so on drugs, I said, sure. So I went and I did that for 3 years, and again, that pushed me down this path further, because in that job, I got to do all sorts of cool things on campus, dealing with faculty with environmental interests from the law school and the business school and engineering and philosophy and history and so on. But really also deepening the interactions outside with government, with foundations, with nonprofits, and even with the private sector, and, you know, realizing firsthand that there were really smart people in all those places, and many of them had PhDs, and they were pursuing careers as PhDs with research training and that orientation in other sectors and actually contributing to solutions. So to fast forward a little more, 2007 rolls around, I'm aggravated at the provost about something particularly short-sighted that had occurred, and a job ad crossed my desk to work at a foundation, and I thought, giving away money, that should be fun. And so I applied for the job, thought nothing about it, and the further I got into the application process, the more genuinely interested I grew, and that job was at a private foundation based in Seattle called the Wilberforce Foundation, that is basically about terrestrial conservation motivated by good science and policy. And the portfolio that I ended up getting hired to manage was a grants portfolio in Alaska and parts of Western Canada. So enormous swaths of public land, incredibly complex circumstances involving small communities, big industry, terrestrial systems, marine systems, fundamentally indigenous land, and very politically potent places like Alaska in the US imagination and northern Canada in the Canadian imagination. So I did that for a few years, and then I got recruited to my current job at Tides Canada Foundation based in Vancouver, which is a slightly different version of a grant-making foundation. Instead of being privately endowed by a single donor, we work with a wide range of donors, both huge foundations that you've probably heard of, as well as wealthy individuals, and help them work together to be more strategic in their philanthropy. And our sweet spot is kind of complex situations of the sort that interdisciplinary researchers and scholars would address in a university context. And this is doing the same thing, but with grant dollars, trying to move the needle on different aspects of issues in the real world. So that's 15 years in maybe 6 minutes. So some observations, and this is very off the cuff, and I'm happy to discuss all this, but some observations now that I've spent a few years diving deep into the weeds of complex sustainability solutions type stuff, are that some of these things have their origins in academia, like yours. Others have their origins in other places and have remarkably little participation by academics. And so I tried to ask myself, well, what seem to be the language and the attributes of the ones that come out of academia versus that have their origins elsewhere? So university-driven things, in my observation, tend to involve words like outreach. So we are the university, we are the center of the universe, and we reach out to everybody else, or research that is applied, right? Certainly the word interdisciplinary is often used, or transdisciplinary. This kind of lingo around knowledge to action, which David and I discussed a bit last night, and I know you guys have discussed a lot. And then sort of pushing beyond technology transfer, so not just getting money from patents for universities, but actually measuring societal outcomes in other ways, not always monetary. I've also been involved, around the edges anyway, of some of these big interdisciplinary projects that really haven't been university driven. And they've tended to be driven by NGOs or other civil society actors. They're often ground up and need-based. In some of the ones I'm most familiar with, the money has come not from public agencies or intellectual capital from universities, but from private foundations. Often the communities are somewhat similar to some of the ones that you have in Maine. They're rural, they're remote, in many cases they're native communities. Aboriginal is the generic word in Canada for native communities. The participants often include governments and industry, although governments and industry are rarely the drivers. Often they're brought to the table later. And I think where we're at now is that some of these, and I'll give you a couple of examples, have become sort of high-profile integrated solutions packages. They deal with iconic landscapes, they've often attracted large amounts of money, and they aren't fully delivering on their promise of solutions, in part because of this critical issue of implementation. So somebody will come up with a really pretty-looking package of diverse actors based upon good thinking and good theory and goodwill, but somehow the capacity is lacking to fully implement, let's say, a multi-party agreement. So just a bit about the platform I'm working from now. This thing at the top is the tagline for Tides Canada Foundation, where I work. It's kind of cute. Uncommon solutions for the common good. That solutions language, I suspect, would resonate with your SSI orientation. And my job is to lead a team that tries to make that real and not just a slogan. Little incremental, measurable, potentially scalable ways. And we're accountable not just to a range of funders, but really to the outcomes both for the environment and communities that we work with. So I'll give you a bit about the tools of the trade. I will make a comment about interdisciplinary here. I mean, the mission of the foundation I'm at now is about both environmental solutions and social justice solutions, which includes, economic and cultural issues. Where I worked before was really straight up conservation, and so to the extent that there were human dimensions, you had to kind of sneak those in around the edges. And again, this is all very reminiscent of my days, in the academy, where I was a biologist. And to some biologists, it's really edgy and interdisciplinary to work with a chemist and call it biochemistry. And then you take some further steps down that path and suddenly you're working with economists and then you're working with humanists, and then you're working with non-academics, and all of a sudden you're actually working with the set of parties that are most relevant and centered on a particular problem, again, as you guys are. I added these two bullets this morning because I was thinking, okay, all this is about attempting to solve complex real-world problems. The question for universities, I think, is what is their role? What value added do universities really have to offer here? And do they lead or do they follow? What's the currency of reward and valuation in universities versus in communities? What's the role of research? What's the role of education? What's the role of capacity building? And similarly for foundations, what's the role of money? There's lots of situations in which money just does not help when it is added to a potent or volatile or complex situation. So just as you want to be kind of responsible and outcome-oriented about academia tackling these sorts of problems, foundations also want to be responsible about adding money to a mix and making sure that it does some good. Okay, so this is, I'm not going to get any wonkier than this, but just to give you a sense of some of the tools that foundations use when they're working together on problems like this. I mentioned this to some of you earlier, but you know, the foundation sector, and I'm happy to talk about this more, is really mysterious to a lot of people. Oh, they're private actors and they have money and they make grants and I want some. It's kind of how most people think about it. And when I first started working in foundations, people told me a few things because I was new to it. One thing they said was, you can't generalize about foundations. If you know one foundation, you know one foundation. And that's pretty much true. They all have their own origins. They all have trustees who have particular values and outcomes in mind with the money. Some are strategic and science-based. Some are painfully random. There's 80,000 foundations in the United States, ranging from little family foundations with no professional staff to Bill and Melinda Gates combining their dough with Warren Buffett, and they've got a pretty big operation. And there's sort of everything in between and all sorts of issues that are being tackled. The other thing people told me is that foundations don't collaborate very well. And after I heard that, within about 6 months, I found myself part of 2 or 3 different funder collaboratives that were great. Not always easy, but really stimulating. And when tackling complex issues, this foundation, even if it's huge, can only deal with this chunk, and this foundation deals with this chunk, and these 3 small foundations deal with this chunk. And if people are working together well, and collaboration means different things in different contexts, that can be not only productive for outcomes, but also really satisfying. And one of the things I discovered to my delight is that a lot of really smart people work at foundations and NGOs, including a lot of PhDs. And so given the demographics of jobs, for those of you who are grad students or postdocs, I'm here to tell you based on firsthand experience that you can go work in places that aren't universities and do really interesting things with really smart people, some of whom have PhDs and some of whom don't. But I was really surprised to see how many PhDs and ex-academics there are in this sector, not just in foundations, but also in a bunch of nonprofits that are my grantees. And that sort of higher level of research experience and analytical thinking is often game-changing and sort of professionalizing the sector. It doesn't solve all your problems, but it's sometimes kind of nice to have around. So we work with donors big and small, alone or in concert, to help them plan strategies for portfolios of grants. So not just doing a grant to this organization, but maybe doing a portfolio of a dozen grants that collectively act to move the needle on a certain issue. We can do that pretty fast. We bring parties together. Foundations are famous for convening strange bedfellows. And then we try to think a little bit about evaluation, although as I was discussing with some of you this morning, getting those metrics right so that you know you're making progress towards something and it's not illusory is a big part of it. So this is who I work with day to day. A range of issues, big issues like food, water, energy, conservation, a number of different places, at least in my experience with this field, there's a strong place-based orientation, which also seems resonant to a place like Maine, and then with funder colleagues as well as grantees. And I just want to give you really quick a few examples of what this looks like out in the world in places that might involve academic research occasionally, but it's not the main driver. Occasionally, though, I think that the right kind of academic resource and thinking, perhaps like you guys, would have moved some of these complex initiatives a bit faster or informed them a bit better. I've done a lot of work in the Tongass in Southeast Alaska in my previous job. Those of you who know forest history know that this is one of the most iconic and conflict-ridden forested landscapes in the U.S. Just to the south of that, the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, I'll say a bit about. And then if I have time at the end, I'll talk a bit about some stuff I've been involved with in the Arctic. When I go out to rural communities, I see things like this. This is at the entrance to the village of Atlin in the very northwest corner of British Columbia, just south of the Yukon border. And this is a kind of manifesto about the connection of the community to its land, its water, and its sand. And on one level, this is kind of a nice statement. On another level, it's a policy driver, particularly in a place like this landscape where Aboriginal rights and title issues are unfolding in the Canadian courts. It's a transboundary issue. The lower part of this watershed touches Alaska. And the science capacity of governments is being cut because of austerity budgets everywhere. And so all of a sudden, a tiny community like this has stewardship jurisdiction driven by values like this over 8 million acres of land, which contains one of the biggest wild salmon watersheds left on the planet. And so if you're thinking about conservation, this play is not about a bunch of traditional conservation advocacy groups. This play is about providing some sort of support based on trust and partnerships to the people whose land it is and who really want to do science and stewardship properly. And if NGOs can help with that, that's great. If governments can help, that's great. If foundations can help, that's great. But it's kind of a reorientation of the approach to conservation for a lot of people. And it's not at all straightforward, but in certain places, it's most likely to be effective. So on a slightly larger scale here, I just want to show a couple slides about there's going to be an academic literature on this, there's already a small one, about conservation outcomes in places that are fairly remote. But if you were to just talk about wilderness values, you wouldn't be describing things very accurately. So this green is the west coast of North America. It's the historic range of coastal temperate rainforest habitat, which is a strongly integrated marine and terrestrial system featuring salmon at the heart of it, things like bears and coastal wolves at the heart of it, lots of whales, and indigenous people for 10,000 years who today live in communities like these, almost all of which are off the road network. And so the key set of questions becomes, how does one or a set of ones advance conservation outcomes such that these little communities have an economy, such that they retain their cultural ties to land and water, which includes a big food security component, and so that other economic actors such as the timber industry aren't shut down, but are acting at scales that are consistent with both small communities, economies, and conservation. So those are kind of the big questions. Those questions, historically, in this landscape, have led to nothing but conflict that goes under the banner war in the woods. And that's been true in Southeast Alaska for decades, and it's been true also on the British Columbia coast. So there's a few efforts that foundations have been involved with over the last few years that we can talk about later today to kind of shift the way business is done in these kinds of places. So just to get you oriented here, this is Vancouver Island. There's the city of Vancouver where I live. There's Seattle. Coastal temperate rainforest originally went all the way down to Central California, and it's pretty much hammered from Central California to northern Vancouver Island. Above that, you see this darker green. It's much more intact. This piece of the Canadian coast was rebranded by some combination of the environmental community and the native community, the Great Bear Rainforest, in the mid-90s. And that's now the term that you see when this is described worldwide. Before that, the same landscape was called the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area. So the rebranding was actually helpful in raising a lot of dough, which I'll tell you about in a second. North of that, up here, is the Tongass National Forest, which is the Alaska Panhandle. It's the biggest national forest in the U.S. by a factor of 3, 17 million acres. Little rural communities like this, lots of salmon, and again, long-term conflict between environmentalists, small communities, and the timber industry. So just, you know, I'm going to be telling you about these kind of very pretty sustainability solutions that look great on paper and are pretty good up to a point. And there's a couple of wrinkles that we're trying as a group of funders to figure out how to deal with philanthropically. And there's beginning to be some academics working in the landscape, University of Alaska, University of British Columbia, and so on. We're trying to figure out how to do the same thing. So number one, as I mentioned earlier, capacity and implementation are a big challenge. So there was a $120 million deal that was crafted. $120 million in conservation financing. So this is why it's going to be in all the textbooks. It's, you know, the world is looking at this as a model. Of the $120 million, half is for conservation and half is for economic development that's consistent with conservation, all under the banner of EBM, ecosystem-based management, which in this landscape in BC is defined as equal parts ecosystem measurables and human well-being measurables. There's politics that happens that sometimes interferes with the best laid plans, and so the pictures I'm showing you here are indicative of the politics of the global energy economy. You've probably all heard of the so-called tar sands or oil sands in northern Alberta. We now have a pretty conservative federal government in Canada that is very interested in exporting Alberta oil to Asia. That would require a pipeline that would go from Alberta through the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest and put the oil into tankers that would go through fjords that are not only filled with iconic wildlife, but are the traditional territories of 20 First Nations. So that's the big deal. And that is the political situation that is distracting everybody from implementation of a very well-crafted plan and full use of the $120 million in conservation financing. The capacity just isn't there because everyone's distracted. So this is a picture taken in the meeting hall in this village, Hartley Bay, in Git-Gat First Nations traditional territory, gorgeous. And they're ground zero for where the coastal tankers would go through. So this is one of the community meetings when the National Energy Review Panel was holding its hearings across the country, including out on the coast. This slide I threw in to remind me to say something about connections between local and global, and again, how do you approach this stuff through grant making, right? So this is a picture I took a couple weeks ago in my local Whole Foods, and I thought, this illustrates it as well as anything. So it shows the whole West Coast. They're selling fresh salmon. The salmon economy on this coast is nowadays about 10 times what the timber economy is. But the timber economy remains iconic. And there's an ecological interaction between timber harvest and salmon productivity. But it definitely is a salmon forest, and the map shows, again, all of BC and up into Alaska. So these are transboundary systems, absolutely. And I really like pushing fellow funders on this because the political boundaries in these kinds of geographies, and I suspect this might be true here too, right, given your neighbors, are really artificial. The salmon don't give a crap about the border. The whales don't, the bears don't, and the indigenous people don't. The Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, 1867 along comes the border, which is about, 148 generations into the 155 that they've been there, something like that. And you follow this border on up and you find the same thing with caribou and Athabascan people. You go further north to the high Arctic, you find the same thing with bowhead whales and Inuit people. So if you're thinking about conservation, even with human dimensions, there's the policy environment, which is politically bounded, but there's a whole lot of other things where there might be comparative approaches, shared capacity approaches, shared stock approaches, and shared cultural approaches. And so when governments are remotely interested in thinking transboundary and everybody else does it naturally, then these are opportunities to be grasped. It's also integrated land sea. Again, this is the interdisciplinary problem with foundations. Terrestrial funders, I don't want to talk about saltwater. Ocean funders, what's a tree, right? And so you got to kind of smooth these conversations, much like interdisciplinary work in the academy. And then again, these dimensions of conservation and human well-being. So I throw this in gratuitously because I know Lynn Ostrom was here, but again, it's some of the sort of good thinking and intellectual capacity that universities bring often appears in philanthropic strategy. So for example, we are now in the process of using some of Lynn Ostrom's work and associated theory to build a program of grant making for the next generation in the Great Bear Rainforest to deal with some of these capacity challenges, to access this original dose of $120 million. One of the ways in which we're doing that is by looking for a different type of grantee, not traditional environmental groups, but what one of my staff calls FNNGOs, so First Nations NGOs. And ignore these other acronyms, but basically these are new types of civil society actors. They are not tribal governments, nor are they environmental groups. They're things that are beginning to grow up organically in particular landscapes, and you could think of them as, Aboriginal environmental NGOs or something like that. But it's a different take. It's a take that is strongly conservation oriented, but isn't about wilderness. It's about history and tradition and human use and food security and culture. Oh, and by the way, big fat conservation outcomes. So we're looking at building the capacity of those, trying to work on this funder collaborative stuff, and then thinking about scaling this concept to other places, in particular the Arctic. And I'm not going to go through a bunch of Arctic stuff, but I think that's 100 times the scale, and it's going to be a fascinating part of our planet for the rest of our lives when it comes to governance, conservation, globalization, culture, north-south linkages, and so on. And then finally, I just pulled this because I think we still always have this conundrum. So this is a quote from a paper I wrote with others after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and this was the sort of frontispiece to the paper. It sums up the science problem. You get a guy with 4 PhDs saying no fish were hurt, and then you get a guy with 4 PhDs saying, yeah, a bunch of fish were hurt. They just kind of delete each other out. This is what a lot of people think about science, right? And so we've all had those experiences of going into communities and hopefully not using the language, I'm here to help you, but that's often how it's perceived, and it takes a bunch of visits, to build the trust that you actually really do care how other people are seeing the problems, and then you've got to translate it back to what will let you deliver the products that work for the currency of academia. So I think if academia or philanthropy are going to be really useful in these kinds of settings, We've got to just be patient and do a lot of listening and keep nudging ourselves a little outside our comfort zones without going so far out that we, can't function wherever it is we actually get our paychecks. So it's tricky, but I'm empathetic with what you're trying to do with the point. So finally, just a few reflections on the research enterprise, because I have done a number of grants over the years to universities, and boards say, why would you want to do that? They're not going to do anything useful, and I think sometimes they do. And those are things that should be incentivized, right, when possible. So feel free to push back on any of this. This is sort of off the cuff. So to be accepted by communities in complex circumstances, here's what I came up with. Research must be visible and obviously relevant in particular places. It must meet people where they're at and be valuable at a particular time. The relationships, in my experience, need to be both iterative and adaptive. In other words, you don't just get off the plane once. You're judged by who you got off the plane with, and then never come back. I think this is true. Research that communities really value can't be optically academic, meaning you don't lead with axes, right? You lead with questions of mutual interest, expressed not through jargon. And I know you guys know all this, but I've just, we've all seen the dark side of it, right? I think this notion of durable solutions isn't something that's built out of whole cloth. It's something where there's nudges. One of my favorite metaphors in the philanthropic community is this notion of, grant making as small nudges of a system. Nudges based on hunches, based on data, based on intuition. There's an art and a science to it. And then finally, this notion of, integrating human dimensions in nature. And I know you guys get that, but, it's amazing how many institutions and leaders out there still think in terms of either one or the other. And then just in terms of academic opportunities, and here I was thinking mainly about universities that I know a bunch of people out in the geographies in the west and north where I work. But they could be really helpful in connecting some of the dots related to capacity building in a way that really is authentic to meets community needs. The scale is really tricky. Scale's always tricky with these questions, but grants can be deployed at any level from a village to a global policy shop like the Arctic Council or anything in between. And it's a kind of constant thought process to think about what is the blend of scales in which it makes sense to invest, given the amount of money available and given where the leadership is. And again, there might be similar questions with research. And then this notion of interdisciplinarity. This is something I used to just talk about when I was directing programs at the university. And I think where I eventually concluded in my own mind was that there was a lot of doing of interdisciplinary education and research because it has been trendy off and on for the last 20, 30 years. But the real reasons to do it are if it makes sense given the questions you're trying to ask. And so, I think I now think the same way about collaboration among funders. There's certain small and marginally interesting problems that one funder can just do on their own. And the really big complex things, you collaborate because you're more effective than you would be if you didn't collaborate. And so to me, interdisciplinarity is kind of the same way. You do it if you're more effective than trying to answer a complex question with the tools of a single discipline. So I'm going to stop there. I am happy to say a bit about the North if anyone wants to, because I'm sort of into it these days. But I think I'll stop and see if there's any questions or anything you'd like to discuss. So thanks for your patience and time. Yes.
I've had debates with very conservative people in the past that have taken the position that the environmental conservation is the role of NGOs and not government. And making it sound like it was the dream plan that environmental laws and regulations and land conservation were all done privately by foundations, not government. But I have a very different view that the honor of service and the purpose of government is very much tied to environmental and health and things. And also there's some great examples that it's worked. USDA, the Soil Conservation Service being one back in the 30s and so forth. My question is, where do NGOs see them in that world of, do they see them as an enhancement of government's operations, or the exact same thing as industry but working on other topics?
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, I think I understand your question. So when it comes to conservation, it really depends on where you are too. So in a country such as the one we're in, here in Maine, tons of private land, right? So the approaches are going to be very different than in the places where most of my experience on this side of the aisle comes from, which is out west. So in Alaska, 75–80% public land. In most of western and northern Canada, even more. So there's a role for NGOs in both. That traditional role of the more conservative conservation NGOs, such as the Nature Conservancy, historically has been to buy the land. If the Conservancy or land trusts are going to be relevant in parts of the continent where there's not a lot of public land and where the biggest conservation opportunities are, then they've got to develop some different tactics. And if it's public land, then those tactics involve governments. And depending on the government of the day, it might be a very collaborative relationship or it might be an adversarial relationship. I think, in the US right now with federal public land, it's a pretty collaborative relationship. And in fact, a number of people that I know from the foundation world, as well as ones you know from the academic world, have received appointments in the Obama administration, and the political winds blow and all that stuff. But there's a bunch of really well-qualified science and policy kinds of people who are across, government agencies right now, and those people work very well with NGOs. And in fact, I still have collaborative conversations with people in government all the time, and the tenor of them is, we in government need help from civil society. There's stuff that we just can't do. Could you guys do some grants to these organizations to build their science capacity to work with us more effectively? So that's public government, but the same sort of conversation can happen with indigenous governments, again, in cases like Alaska and much of Canada, where public land is also both sort of historically, morally, and constitutionally and legally Aboriginal land. And so those guys need the same kind of capacity as non-Aboriginal NGOs to be at the table in these kinds of negotiations.
So just following up on Sean's question.
Yeah.
One of the things I was hearing and what he was asking was, what about the durability of solutions? So, you have, what's your take on that in terms of how it develops when you have a group of NGOs and funders, and then eventually the funds go away, versus, then you're working with government in different areas?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you, that's a great question, and, everyone likes to talk about durability, and everyone likes to be, out of the room before they have to do anything about it, right? So I'll give you an example of an attempt at this. So that sign I showed you from the village of Atlin, the Tawga River Tlingit First Nation, those guys, that's a small First Nation in British Columbia who had a court case involving a mine in their traditional territory. And they took that court case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada said to the province of British Columbia, which is constitutionally the land manager of Crown land, so that's a contrast with federal land in the States. The court said to BC, you must engage in a rigorous land use planning process with this First Nation. That is your duty, that is the duty of the Crown under the obligation to consult and accommodate a First Nation on activities in its traditional territory. And these are nations that have neither historic treaties nor modern treaties, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about the title to the land, and so pro-development governments are motivated to settle these land claims because it gives more certainty to industry. This is what happened in Alaska in a somewhat more cynical way with the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971 before the oil development at Prudhoe Bay could happen. So here's this little First Nation. They went through a long multi-year negotiation process with the BC government. They did a fantastic conservation area design that incorporated a whole lot of biological data as well as a bunch of cultural and traditional use data. Developed a land use plan, got a bunch of new protected areas, developed some new decision-making processes that produce high bar salmon conservation and stuff. But there's two parties to the agreement. One is a province with 4 million people. The other is a small First Nation with 400 people. And that asymmetry created an opportunity for philanthropy to step in, level the playing field, and the durability question is, do you fund NGOs forever to help out the Tlingit? Or do you really want to put the Tlingit in the driver's seat, help them build the long-term capacity to steward the land in negotiation with the public government, and then let the NGOs get out of the way and go do something else? In the case of this particular NGO that's been helping for the last 15 years, they're now stepping out of the Tlingit territory and working on projects with the Navajo in Utah, and with some folks in Namibia, and with some folks in Peru. My foundation has worked with a number of other foundations to build an endowment fund, which will be part of the long-term revenue stream for one of these new FNNGOs, one of these new First Nations NGOs, that will work in tandem with both the First Nation government and the provincial government to provide that long-term capacity in conservation science, but also in the other things that matter to small communities, like programs that get youth and elders together on the land.
Not sure how to ask the question, but in fisheries, a lot of very large foundations have, over the last decade, put a lot of money, a lot of PR, a lot of effort into promoting transfer of quotas, individual transfer of quotas, or catch shares, as they are now.
Yeah.
We're now getting a lot of evidence that they're not working. What, and there's no evidence that the foundations that promoted this are being responsive to
Our learnings?
They are very much committed and defensive of their past policies. If we look at this environmental process as a learning process, is there, I told you this was a difficult question, is there a way that a mechanism, a system, a reason to believe that large foundations will back off erroneous policies?
It's a really good question. It's a fair question. I know who you're talking about. There should be a reason to think they will change their behavior in the face of data. And, in principle, most foundations like to learn, but like many universities, they're also just structurally conservative, right? I mean, in the university, we're operating based on a system that was developed 700 years ago in Europe. It doesn't change super fast. It doesn't turn on a dime. And the bigger foundations get, the more they can act that way. Most foundations that are on the strategic end of the spectrum, the kind that would use words like catch shares and marine spatial planning and stuff, are members of larger grant maker affinity groups, which themselves promote collective learning, often by bringing in groups of experts, many of those from academia. And so I think that the learning thing is only inevitable, but painfully slow. I mean, literally this afternoon or tomorrow, I am going to go to a meeting in Brunswick. And I will meet with a person I like very much who will be talking about nothing but cat chairs and MSP, right? Because she works for a foundation and they said, we've got this strategy and we're going to stick with it for 5 years. So I think this notion of adaptive management and nimbleness in grant-making strategy is just as relevant as those concepts are anywhere else. And I think that, you shouldn't view foundations as big, monolithic, unmovable institutions, even if you're frustrated with them. I mean, I think it's absolutely fair game to have frank, evidence-based conversations with foundations. Does that sort of?
Yeah, I think it's a lot more complicated in the sense that foundations mobilize a lot of, and are very selective about the scientific talent they bring in, and they're very selective and very influential in the media.
Yeah.
In ways that slow down that transition.
I hate it when that happens, actually. But I've seen it happen. That would be an example of doing harm with money, wouldn't it? Yeah.
So can I ask a more generic version of Jim's question? When you talk about nudging durable solutions, I was thinking back to this sort of conflict-ridden situation you talked about in the you call it the war in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get those conflict histories there that persist, how do you as a foundation identify what constitutes a solution in that context?
Well, foundations can't identify what communities want any more than universities can unless they actually go to the communities and talk to people, and talk to the right people and the right range of people over the right period of time and the right set of leaders and institutions. So, I mean, we can sit around in our foundation equivalent of ivory towers all we want and come up with theories of change, but they've got to be ground truths. So in the case of, so we do, there's a lot of ways that we learn. We learn a lot from our grantees, we learn a lot from our non-grantees, we learn by doing due diligence, talking with government partners, going to the field and spending time in communities, understanding the governance context of places, staying around long enough to understand the cultural context of places. Foundations have made plenty of mistakes historically, and the mistakes they make usually have to do with not understanding a bunch of those things, particularly in places like, the north, where you can't just do drive-by. I'm trying to remember you said there was a point you made that I wanted to, I know, in the conflict, in the Tongass. So I'll give you the example from the Tongass. So if you're familiar with the Tongass, you know that it's been just a big fight forever between industrial old-growth timber extraction from public land and pretty edgy far-left environmental advocacy groups, and not a lot in the middle. And what happened in the case of the Tongass was that by 2006, those forces were pretty much at an impasse. Conservationists were not getting any new wilderness gains, and communities were struggling really badly with the failing timber economy, in part because of litigation, and it was just a big mess. So there were a few NGO and foundation people who had some conversations with some Forest Service staff and some community members in Southeast Alaska, and decided to have a meeting, which occurred in fall of 2006. Long story short, that evolved into a thing called the Tongass Futures Roundtable, which was funded by foundations, who actually had seats at the table. That's pretty unusual. And it was a multi-party, solutions-oriented table that met 4 to 6 times a year, every time in a different community, for about 5 years and really did two kinds of things. One was build trust among people who hated each other, and that was iterative, and also worked on specific time-delimited problems with an eye to getting those out of the way as obstacles so that more durable solutions could be crafted. Solutions that might involve a critical mass of good jobs in tiny rural communities off the road network, and also new gains in conservation that did unusual things, right? Like tie forest conservation to the elephant in the room that everybody cared about, which was the fisheries economy. And so this was a remarkable experience for me. So I went to different communities in Southeast Alaska every 2 or 3 months for the 3.5 years that I was on the plane. And I got to know the mill owners, Forest Service brass, indigenous leaders, mayors, and environmentalists, some of whom had a very collaborative, genuine community orientation, and some of whom were just honestly left-wing ideologues around top-down federal roadless policy, and pretended to care about the communities but would happily throw them under the bus based on action in DC. And so a bunch of my grantees actually found it every bit as frustrating dealing with sort of green-on-green friendly fire conflict as dealing with genuine sleeves-rolled-up collaborative mill owners, or dare I say it, even Forest Service people. So that was one of these kinds of experiments in bringing different parties together, having the right analytical tools like mapping tools and facilitation of process. And, you know, I'd like to say that produced big outcomes. I think it produced some small outcomes. There were some real attempts at congressional legislation, and those were fairly encouraged by both senators in Alaska of 2 parties as well as the administration, but it just it never got across the finish line. There's a sort of similar but different story in BC Coast, and there's some potentially similar stories unfolding in the north. But it's about this whole notion, which doesn't really happen much in the US anymore, of talking to people other than yourself.
Exactly. I'm going to, there's many of these conversations to continue, but I'm going to take a pause now for people to go to other meetings and so on, and thank Dave again for being here. If you want to join the other meetings,